The snow had been falling since before she left Billings, and it was still falling when she reached Harlow. She had made this drive before, the long road north out of town, the cottonwoods thinning, the land opening into something flat and gray and enormous. But she had always made it in summer, when the fields held color, and her grandmother was standing on the porch before the wagon reached the yard. Now the porch was empty, the fields were white. The house sat in the late afternoon silence the way abandoned things sit, without apology. She tied the horse at the post and stood for a moment in the cold. The door was unlocked. It had always been unlocked. Inside, the air was still and faintly sweet with old wood smoke. She stood in the front room and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. Everything was where it had always been, the chairs at the same angles, the quilt folded over the arm of the rocker. A woman who had lived alone for years finds a way to keep things placed, and her grandmother had been precise about placement, not from vanity, but from the knowledge that disorder costs you when you are the only one who will set it right. She moved to the kitchen. The soup pot hung on its hook above the cold hearth, scoured clean and dry. The shelf above the window held a tin cup, a small blue-painted canister for salt, and at the end, square and dented at one corner, the sewing tin. She had seen that tin her entire life. Blue paint worn to silver at the edges, a small nick on the lid, where something had struck it once, years ago, before she was born. Her grandmother kept it on the same shelf, the way she kept everything, without explanation, as though the fact of a thing holding its position was itself a kind of statement. She did not touch it yet. She built a fire instead, because the cold was serious, and because there was work ahead, and she wanted her hands warm before she started. She fed the kindling in slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her, and watched the flame take hold. The kitchen began to smell like itself again, the particular smell of that hearth, that wood, that house. When the fire was going, she sat down at the table. The afternoon light came through the west window flat and white. Outside, the fields ran to the tree line and stopped. 160 acres. She had heard that number her entire life, without thinking about it, the way you hear a word so often it loses its shape. Now, sitting in the empty kitchen with her grandmother, 3 days in the ground, the number felt different. She did not know why. She looked at the sewing tin on the shelf. She would get to it. There was the whole house to clear, every room, every drawer. She would get to it. She cleared the parlor first, took 3 hours and filled 2 crates. The bedroom she saved for last, because the bedroom was hardest, because the smell there was still her grandmother's smell and she was not ready. By late afternoon, she had worked her way back to the kitchen, and the sewing tin was still on the shelf where it had always been. She reached up and took it down. It was lighter than she expected. It always had been, but she had never thought about why. The lid was stiff from the cold, and she worked it with her thumb until it gave. Inside, thread in 3 colors, a thimble worn thin at the crown, 2 spare buttons that did not match anything she could remember, and beneath all of that, folded small and tight, a piece of paper. She set the buttons on the table, set the thimble beside them, lifted the paper out. It was not a letter, it was a document, official, heavy stock, the kind that meant something at a courthouse. She unfolded it once, then again. The script was formal and close, the kind a notary used, and she had to turn toward the window to read it in the flat winter light. 160 acres, Township 14, Range 26 East. Deed held in the name of her grandmother's name. She read it again. The date at the bottom was 1866. There was a notary stamp, a seal from Billings. She stood there a long time, long enough that the fire shifted and resettled behind her, and she did not hear it. There was something beneath the deed, another fold of paper, smaller. She did not touch it yet. Autumn, 1866. The same kitchen, the same shelf, though the tin on it was newer then, the blue paint still sharp at the corners. She was at the table, the widow, with a candle lit against the early dark and a ledger open in front of her that was not really a ledger. It was a page torn from the back of the family Bible, the blank one, and she had covered it in figures so many times the pencil marks had gone soft from erasing and rewriting and erasing again. $340, due the 1st of November. She had $41 and some coins in a jar by the door, and 2 children asleep upstairs, and a pot of soup on the stove that was mostly water now because the salt pork had given out 3 days ago. The bean soup, the last of it really. She had stretched it 4 days further than she thought she could. Outside, the wind was moving through the grass the way it did in October, low and purposeful. She could hear it at the corners of the house. She looked at the number again. $340. She blew out the candle to save it and sat in the dark with her hands flat on the table. She had been over the number so many times it had stopped being a number. It had become a shape, a wall. $340, and she had 41, and the 1st of November was 19 days away. In the morning, she would not let herself think about it until the children were fed, and the boy was out on the east fence line. She had been sending him there since September, a 9-year-old working a grown man's repair job with a grown man's tools because there was no one else. He did not complain. She watched him go each morning with his coat too short in the sleeves, and she kept her face even until he was over the rise. The girl was 6 and could carry things: water from the pump, wood from the pile, a basket of mending to the widow, who lived the other side of the creek and paid in eggs. 4 eggs last week, 3 the week before. The girl did not know what the eggs were for. She thought it was a kindness between neighbors. The widow let her think that. The soup had started with a real bone and half a pound of salt pork 2 weeks back. She had cooked it in stages, the way you do when there is not enough. A little each day, water added each morning. The pot never fully emptied. The pork had gone first, then the cartilage and the marrow, then the flavor of them, and then even the memory of the flavor. What was left was beans in hot water with a smell of salt that was more history than taste. She had baked cornbread that morning because she had cornmeal still, and because the children needed something solid, and she had eaten none of it herself. She told them she was not hungry. She ate a spoonful of the broth standing at the stove while their backs were turned. Every motion in that kitchen was the same. Handle the jar with both hands so it does not slip. Fold the cloth twice before you set it down, so it dries flat and can be used again. Put the wooden spoon back on the left side of the pot, not because it mattered, because doing things the same way every time meant you did not waste the second it took to decide where things went. She had learned that from her mother. Her mother had learned it from a life that did not leave room for ceremony. She sat at the table now in the dark she had made by blowing out the candle. The wick was still warm. She could smell it. That particular smell of a candle just extinguished, thin and waxy, and specific to nowhere else in the world but a dark room where a woman is trying to hold something together by arithmetic. The wind moved along the eaves. The boy had pulled a muscle in his shoulder Thursday. He had not said so. She had seen him favor his left arm at supper and said nothing either. She heard the horse before she saw it. Not a sound she could name right away. Just a change in the quality of the evening. A soft percussion against the dry ground that did not belong to wind or the settling of the barn. She was at the window before she had decided to move. A gray horse, a man on it, sitting easy, the way men sit when they have been riding long enough that the horse is simply where they live. He came along the property line at a walk, not cutting across the field the way someone looking for trouble would. He followed the fence. That was the first thing she noticed. He followed the fence as though he understood it meant something. The satchel was across his saddle. A rolled length of canvas was strapped behind him, tied at both ends. He stopped at the gate post and looked at the house. He did not call out. She was already opening the door. The light was going. The sky had that particular color it held for 20 minutes in late autumn. Not orange, not gray. A color that had no name she knew. It made everything look like it was waiting. He took his hat off when she came out. She did not ask where he was going or where he had come from. Those were questions that answered themselves eventually, and in the meantime, wasted daylight. She said the soup was still hot. He looked at her steadily for a moment. He had eyes that had spent a long time measuring distances, not unkind, just used to working. He said that was more than he had a right to ask for. She said he had not asked. She had offered. There was a difference. He tied the horse at the post. He did not hand her the reins to hold, did not ask where to put anything. He moved around the side of the house toward the barn, the way a person moves when they have spent their life figuring out where things go by looking. She went back inside. The pot was still on the stove. The cornbread was on the board where she had left it, wrapped in cloth. She set 2 bowls on the table. She put the second-to-last candle in the holder and lit it. There was one left after this. She noted it the way she noted everything, without ceremony, without feeling. Just the fact of it added to the running tally. He came in quietly, hat in his hand, and sat where she gestured without pulling the chair out unnecessarily far. He ate without speaking. That was fine. She sat across from him with her own bowl, and neither of them needed to fill the air. The candle burned between them. The boy was asleep. The girl was asleep. Outside, the gray horse stood at the post, and the last of the light left the sky without anyone watching it go. She cleared the bowls. She carried the candle to the shelf and stood it beside the one that remained. 2 inches of wax left in the holder, and the cold coming through the door frame the way it always did in October, pressing low along the floor. She did not hear him leave the house. One moment there was a man sitting across her table, and then there was just the table. She latched the door and went to bed. In the morning she rose before the children and built the fire up and stood at the window while the coffee heated. The sky was the color of pewter, the fields still gray, the light not yet committed to the day. She looked toward the barn. The barn door was closed. The gray horse was in the corral, where she had not put it, which meant he had moved it in the night, or first thing, before she was watching. She was watching now. He was already at the east fence line. She could see him at the far edge of the near field, his coat folded over the top rail, working in shirt sleeves in the October cold. She did not know where he had found wire. There was a partial spool in the lean-to she had not touched since spring, because there was always something more pressing, and she had not had the hands for it. He had found it. He was stringing it now, pulling each length taut before he fixed it, moving down the post line, the way a man moves when he is not performing the work, but simply doing it. She watched him for a while. The coffee boiled over, and she pulled it off the heat without looking away from the window. He did not look up. Not once. Not toward the house, not toward the road, not anywhere that was not the fence in front of him. He worked with the concentrated quiet of someone who has learned that looking up invites conversation, and conversation is a thing that slows the work. She understood this. She turned from the window and poured the coffee. When the children woke, she had their breakfast on the table. The boy asked about the man, and she said he was working. The boy wanted to go out, and she said, "After you eat." The girl said nothing, only climbed into her chair and ate. She was like that. She noticed things without asking about them. The woman had thought more than once that the girl would be all right, whatever came. After breakfast, she put on her coat and went out to the pump. She did not go toward the fence line. She did not bring him coffee or call across the field. The work was not hers to interrupt. She could see him still at the far post, the wire catching the early light. She pumped the water and carried it inside. That was how they understood each other in those first hours. Not by speaking, by staying out of the way of what the other one was doing. The barn door had been hanging wrong since spring. She knew this the way she knew most things about the place, not from looking directly, but from the angle of the shadow it threw each morning, from the particular drag and scrape when the boy pulled it open. It had not been an emergency, it had simply been one more thing her husband would have fixed. He spent the morning on it. She watched from the kitchen window without meaning to. He had pulled the door free of its frame entirely and laid it flat in the yard, and now he was working the hinge pins loose with a tool she did not recognize, a short-handled implement he had taken from a canvas roll in the barn, the kind of roll a man keeps when he works with his hands for a living. He set the pins on the flat of a stone. He did not lose them. The hinge plates came off. He worked the screw holes with something, packed them, let them sit. The boy drifted out before she could say anything. She watched him stop at the edge of the yard, hands in his pockets, and stand there in the way boys stand when they want to approach something but are not sure of their welcome. The man did not look up, but when he moved to the next screw, he angled himself slightly, and the boy could see what he was doing. That was enough. The boy crossed the yard and crouched beside him. He handed him tools without being asked, a mallet when the mallet was needed, the level when the door was back in the frame, and the man held out his hand without looking. The boy watched where the bubble sat and said nothing, only pointed, and the man made the adjustment. They did not speak in the way she could hear from the window. The door swung clean. He tested it twice, the full arc, both directions. The scrape was gone. In the afternoon, he went up on the lean-to roof, and she kept the children inside, not out of worry, but because the work was delicate, and she understood that a man fitting sod patches into a roof needed to feel where the water had been coming in, and that required a kind of listening the yard did not afford when there were children running through it. She heard him move above her, steady, methodical, the sound of someone who had done this before. Toward evening, she went to the barn for the milk pail. The surveyor's map was there, propped upright against the inside of the barn door, held in place by the door's own weight. It was rolled and tied, and she could not see what was on it. She stood there a moment. She set the pail under the cow and did not look at the map again. Whatever it was his. She would not be the kind of woman who looked at a man's things. She brought the pail inside. She started supper. The children went to sleep without trouble that night. The boy had worn himself out hauling the scraps of old sod down from the lean-to roof, which the man had let him do after the patching was finished, carrying the pieces in a bucket to the compost pile at the field's edge. The girl had fallen asleep at the table over her supper, and the widow had carried her to bed still in her dress. The house was quiet. She put the kettle on without thinking about it. She had enough coffee left for 2 cups, and she made 2 cups. She set them on the table, one near her chair, one across from it. He came in from the barn a few minutes later, knocked the mud from his boots on the step, and sat down without being asked. The candle between them was already low, the second to last one, the stub she had been rationing since October. It threw a narrow light. Beyond the table, the room was dark, the shapes of the shelves and the window frame just visible against the lesser dark outside. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He drank slowly. He looked at the table, then at the window, then at the shelf. The blue tin sat where it always sat, between the lamp oil and the spare cloth. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize from a different context, briefly, without expression, and then looked away. She noticed. She did not say anything. After a while she asked where he was headed. He said Billings, then east. She nodded. She turned her cup in her hands. The candle shifted in a draft from somewhere, and the light moved across the wall. East was not a destination. It was a direction, a person named when they did not want to say anything more specific, or when specific was not the point. She understood that. She did not press. She thought about saying something about the fence, about the door, about the roof. She thought about saying something about the soup she had given him the first night, the way she had handed him a bowl without asking herself whether she could afford to. She did not say any of it. He set his cup down. He looked at his hands flat on the table. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the barn made its low sound, the settling creak of old timber cooling in the night air. The mortgage note was in the drawer beside the dry sink. It had been there for 6 weeks. She had stopped taking it out. Looking at numbers you cannot change is a kind of self-punishment, and she had decided in September to stop punishing herself for things she had not chosen. She did not look at the drawer. He did not look at the tin again. The candle burned. The coffee went cold. Neither of them moved to end the evening. She woke before light, the way she had every morning since her husband died. Not gradually, but all at once, as though some part of her had stayed watchful through the dark. The house was quiet, in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. She lay still for a moment, reading it. Then she rose. She built the fire first, because that was what you did, because the children would be cold, because her hands needed something to do before her mind caught up with what she already knew. The kindling caught. She stood at the window and looked out toward the barn. The barn door was shut. The gray horse was not in the yard. She put on her coat over her nightdress and went out. The frost had come hard in the night. It lay on everything: the fence posts, the dead grass, the handle of the water bucket, in a thin white skin that crunched under her boots. She crossed the yard and the cold went straight through the wool of her coat, and she did not hurry. Hurrying would not change what she already knew. The barn door was on its new hinge. It opened clean and silent. Inside, the stall was empty. The straw was flattened where he had slept. His blanket was folded at the end of the stall, neat and square, and she stood and looked at that for a long moment. He had left it. That was something, or it was nothing, and she could not tell which. Then she saw it. Propped against the barn door on the outside, she had walked past it coming in, had not seen it in the gray early dark. A rolled canvas, tied with a length of cord. She went back and picked it up. She untied the cord, unrolled the canvas. She knew what a surveyor's map was. Her husband had shown her the one filed with their claim. A rough sketch, adequate, legal. This was not that. This was precise in a way that took her a moment to understand. Every fence line, the creek as it bent east past the cottonwoods, the lean-to addition off the north side of the barn, the corners of the property marked with small crosses, each labeled in a clean, careful hand. 160 acres, plotted to the inch. Her land, drawn as though it mattered. She stood in the open barn door, with the canvas in both hands, and the cold coming in from the north, and she did not move. The frost was still hard on the grass. His horse's hoofprints crossed the yard and went through the gate and out toward the road, and the frost was already softening the edges of them, filling them in, the way weather fills in everything eventually. She looked at the map for a long time. She did not know what it meant. She knew it meant something. She rolled it carefully and carried it inside. She set the map on the shelf above the stove, propped against the wall where she could see it from the table. 4 days passed. The boy went back to school. The girl followed her mother through the morning chores the way she always did, quiet and close at heel. The bean pot was empty, and she started a new one. She patched the knee of the boy's trousers. She banked the fire at night and lay awake listening to the wind work at the eaves of the roof. The same eaves that no longer leaked, and she did not let herself think too far in any direction. On the 4th morning, a rider came up the road from the south. He was not from Harlow. His horse was too clean for local work, and he sat it like a man who spent his days moving between towns rather than working in one. She watched him from the porch as he came through the gate, and she did not call out or move toward him. He stopped and reached into his coat. A document, folded, sealed, with a small wax stamp she recognized as belonging to a land office. He told her it had come through Billings. He told her the note had been settled, the full amount, $340, paid in cash 4 days prior. He told her the deed had been reissued in her name. He did not know who had paid it. He said that plainly, without apology. A man had come in. The transaction was legal. That was the extent of what he could tell her. She took the document. She thanked him. She watched him ride back out through the gate. Then she went inside. She sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the deed and read every word of it. Her name, her land, 160 acres outside Harlow, Montana. The mortgage note discharged, the title clear. She read it through twice. Then she set it flat on the table and put both hands on the edge of the wood, and she sat there. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the girl was talking to the chickens in the low, earnest way she did every morning. The boy would be down the road by now, nearly to school. Light came through the east window and moved slowly across the floor. She sat for nearly an hour without moving. When she finally rose, she did not go to the window or step outside. She went to the shelf. She lifted down the blue tin. She opened it. Thread, 2 spare buttons, the thimble her mother had given her. She placed the deed at the bottom, beneath everything. She closed the lid. She put the tin back on the shelf. Then she went out to see about the chickens. She set the deed on the table. Not carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have gone uncertain, flat, quickly, as if holding it longer might change what it says. The notary stamp was from Billings. She could see that plainly. A rectangular impression, slightly smudged at one corner. The ink faded to the color of a bruise, but still legible. The date beneath it, 4 days after the gray horse had gone through the gate and not come back. 4 days. She traced the date with one finger, without meaning to. The deed itself was formal language, the kind that didn't breathe, heretofore, and duly recorded, and in fee simple, but her grandmother's name ran through it like a seam, appearing where names appeared, claims staked and confirmed and titled clear. 160 acres. Outside Harlow, Montana. The mortgage note discharged in full. At the bottom of the payment record, where the satisfying party was required to sign or initial, 3 letters. R.H.W. She looked at them for a moment. Then she set the deed aside. Beneath it, a piece of paper folded once, then once again, smaller than she expected. The fold lines were sharp and had stayed sharp, something that had been folded and left alone for 31 years, not handled, not worried over. She opened it. The handwriting was plain, no flourish. The letters formed with care but no performance, the way a man writes who learned to write for use rather than impression. You fed a man who had more than he looked like. The land was yours. It still is. That was all. No name, no explanation, no accounting of what he had surveyed, or what he had known, or how a payment of $340 had moved from his leather satchel to a land broker's desk in Billings before the first frost hardened the ground. No apology for leaving before dawn. No farewell. Just the 2 sentences, sitting in the fold of the paper where they had been sitting since the autumn of 1866. She read them again. You fed a man who had more than he looked like. Outside, the fields were white under a low sky. The light coming through the east window was the same winter light it had always been. Thin, unhurried, moving across the floor in the same direction it had moved when her grandmother sat at this table, 31 years ago, and read these same words for the first time. She wondered if her grandmother had cried. She thought probably not. She set the note on the table beside the deed and looked at both of them lying there together in the quiet kitchen, and she did not move for a long time. She picked up the deed and carried it with her. Not to read it again. She knew what it said. She carried it the way you carry something you are not ready to set down. Weight in the hand to confirm the thing is real. She walked out of the kitchen and through the narrow hall and out the back door into the cold. The barn door was the first thing she looked at. She had looked at that door her whole life. The iron strap hinge on the left side, the way it swung clean and even without dragging. She had never thought about it. It had always simply worked. She understood now that it had not always worked, that someone had rehung it in the autumn of 1866, had planed the frame and reset the pin and made sure the thing sat level before he walked away. 31 years of a door that swung clean, and she had never once thought to ask why. She walked to the east fence line. The posts were old now, some of them replaced over the years, but the line ran straight in a way that fence lines on working farms often didn't. The kind of straight that started with someone who knew what they were doing, taking the time to do it correctly. She stood at the corner post and looked down the length of it and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a word for. She went to the lean-to last. The sod roof over it had never leaked. She had heard her grandmother say this once, years ago, that roof has never given me trouble, and she had absorbed it as plain fact. The way you absorb everything a grandmother says without understanding that plain facts sometimes have a history behind them. She stood under the low eave and looked up at the packed sod and felt the cold coming off it, and understood that the reason it had never leaked was because someone had taken it apart and put it back together properly 31 years ago. In the 4 days he had been there, because he could see it needed doing. He had come through with a leather satchel and a rolled map, and left behind 3 repairs and a paid note, and a deed reissued in a woman's name. And her grandmother had accepted it, had carried it alone, not with shame, not with confusion, but with something quieter than either of those things. She had known, from the moment the rider arrived from Billings, exactly what had happened, and exactly what it meant. She had folded the deed and the note into the blue tin, and placed them on the shelf, and gone on living, not hiding it, holding it. She walked back inside. The kitchen was exactly as it had been, the open tin on the table, the deed folded beneath the note, the thimble sitting off to one side where she had set it without thinking. The cold from outside had followed her in, and she felt it at her collar and at her wrists, and she did not move to close the door for a moment, just stood in the frame and looked at the table. Then she closed it. She crossed to the window. The fields were frozen over, pale and flat under a white sky, and the fence lines ran out into the distance the way they always had. The east fence rebuilt in the autumn of 1866, the posts set straight, the wire strung even, 31 years of winters on them, and still standing. She could see the barn from here. The door hung level on its hinges, the way it had always hung. She had never thought to wonder why. 160 acres, exactly as plotted on the map that had hung on the barn wall since before she was born. Unframed, its edges curled with age, tacked at its 4 corners with nails she had assumed her grandfather put there. But her grandfather had been dead 14 months before any of this happened. She had known that. She had simply never assembled the pieces into a question. Her grandmother had lived here 31 more years after that autumn, had planted and harvested and mended and cooked and raised 2 children and watched them have children of their own, and had never once said, "There was a man who passed through and paid what I owed, and I never knew more about him than his initials," had never said, "I was going to lose this land, and then I didn't," had kept it the same way she kept everything, by going on, by being present to what was in front of her rather than what was behind. She stood at the window a long time. The fields did not look different. The fence lines did not look different. The barn stood the way it had always stood. Everything was the same as it had been this morning, before she had opened the tin, and nothing was the same at all. After a while, she turned back to the table. She picked up the note. The handwriting was plain and even. A man who had written things down for a living. Measurements and boundaries and the precise shapes of land. You fed a man who had more than he looked like. The land was yours. It still is. She folded it carefully, along the crease her grandmother had made 31 years ago. She set it back inside the tin, beneath the deed. Then she closed the lid.